So let's talk about some of the biggest and scariest threats that you can face on the battlefields of 10th edition, with a review of 10 of the strongest units in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd put together a few of the strongest units in 40k 10th, with a top 10 ranking talking through some of the biggest and nastiest threats in the game for a bunch of different armies that broadly just seem to be very good for their points cost. This list is largely based on a community post from you guys where I asked you which were the strongest units in 10th edition and what you'd be most worried to see on the other side of the tabletop, specifically asking about the strongest units in the game for the points cost. I thought I'd put that together in a top 10 list, going through from the lower voted units to the highest, though of course all of these are very strong, talk about the unit, what it does for its faction, and why people are kind of concerned about it for how much it costs. By the nature of a bit of a community vote, it will have a few issues. There'll be some overrepresentation of big scary things that make a big impact on the table and deal a lot of damage, compared with cheap objective holders and stuff, plus a bit more representation for factions no one are familiar with, as opposed to slightly more niche ones that you might not see on the table all that often. Still though, I feel like it's a pretty reasonable start to get a good idea of what's considered strong in 10th, and just via their popularity and being well known to be big scary threats, a lot of these will be taken in people's armies. Before we get onto the list proper, I thought I'd just run through a few honourable mentions. Definitely not exhaustive, but these got a few more votes than some of the others. There's the Knight Castellan with the huge anti-knight firepower with towering, definitely not bad to have when it's all covered in guns, though maybe losing out a bit to its Questoris counterparts. Illuminor Zeraz is very expensive, but also very interesting for the Necrons, worsening enemy AP and buffing the AP of your warriors and immortals, really quite strong units in the codex already. Or Gretchen for the points cost are very good value. They farm you command points just for being on objectives, which is where they want to be anyway with their very cheap objective control too. And Zogrod Wartsnagger can actually make them kind of threatening with his super runs upgrade. Vindicare Assassins seem to be making their way into a fair few Imperial lists at least, fairly cheap and fairly potent sniping firepower, kind of useful for knights if they want to slay a warlord for getting them honoured and getting a 5+ feel no pain. Chaos Possessed and Terminated damage bricks can be hard to deal with, particularly using the Mark of Nurgle to stop them being shot, or Rapid Ingress to get them into combat. The Undivided ones can have massive damage as well with a 1 CP for a big 4 rerolls. The Taunar Supremacy armor with its ridiculous gun stats got some mentions for the Tau, plus ghost skills as well with their lone operative shenanigans with OK firepower. And the Tyrannid Barb Gaunt seem to be very undercosted against infantry at least, really quite strong damage dealers against them in the first place, never mind slowing a bunch of things. Let's get into the list proper though, and at joint 10th we have the Hexmark Destroyer. Perhaps a surprising choice to be considered particularly strong in 10th edition, considering it was kind of underwhelming through a lot of 9th, but at 70 points per model with lone operative and some very annoying counterfire type rules, this thing does look like a pain to deal with and potentially could really put a hurt on advancing enemy infantry. Just on its base datasheet, it's a lone operative with deep strike. Lone operative's handy as it can't be shot outside of 12 inches, though has 18-inch range pistols, and those pistols fire off 6 shots hitting on 2s at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 1 with a precision keyword, so it could potentially be used to snipe some characters if needed. I say if it was just that it'd be kind of fine and maybe not particularly stand out. The damage output's okay but not excessive, but perhaps the biggest deal about this guy is that he can fire multiple times in the enemy's turn if things work out well for him. First up, he gets a free Overwatch for 0 CP and gets to hit on 2s while doing so if an enemy infantry unit approaches some warriors or something to try and charge them, he could hopefully gun down a few of them. That certainly makes him a bit of a disruptive threat within the Necron lines in a big formation. Potentially a lot more powerful though is his return fire rule, which happens literally every time a nearby unit within 3 inches of him gets shot. I guess the idea might be that you park him next to a big Necron Warrior phalanx that's on an objective, something the opponent really does need to kill, and they need to focus fire to do so with lots of units. It means that every time they do a shooting attack against those Necron Warriors, this guy gets to fire off his 6 pistols yet one more time. So if they have moved anything to put something within 18-inch range of this guy, then he could be firing off those pistols repeatedly at that target and whittling them down over the course of the shooting phase. It is kind of hard to reach him with lone operative as well. You need to get something within 12 inches of him and then ideally shoot him to death. And if you don't have quite enough damage for that, you can even fire back if you've targeted him as well. His damage does definitely depend on what sort of unit is firing at, going to be far less effective against vehicles and monsters, but still if he gets to fire with it multiple times he might still whittle off a good few wounds off even tough stuff. For more fragile infantry armies though, he could be an absolute nightmare to play against, both with the Overwatch and returning fire. In joint 10th with them, we've also got the Custodian Guard, all around raw stats and danger here. I've decided to include both them and the Wardens here, as I feel like they're almost the same unit really, the main strength being with their stat lines and fairly godly Guardian Spears, and then it depends whether you want to go damage mode or defense mode. Both of them have their advantages. The standard Custodians have a pretty mighty stat line, toughness 6, 3 wounds and a 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable save, plus a 4+ save against mortal wounds as well. The Guardian Spears are just generally threatening in an edition that's where quite a lot of things are only good against either infantry or tanks. 5 attacks with strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 will be able to punch up as well as punch down, and particularly so with a bit of martial guitar giving them lethal hits. They can get good objective control with a Vexilla. If they're on objectives, they have a fights first stratagem, which means they're very hard to charge with a big unit of them. And they've got really strong character support as well, from the Blade Champion giving them a really big charge threat range, a Shield Captain for 3 stratagems, including that lovely one to allow them to resurrect a Custodian from death, or Trajan Valoris for his big melee stats and his Moment Shackle. Then you've got the choice of the flavour of them. The Custodian Guard have 45 points and get 4 rerolls if they're standing on an objective. That's massive damage both at shooting and in combat if the enemy fights them there. And they also get a turn to double shoot their Guardian Spears as well, which is actually a serious amount of anti-infantry fire at damage too. You can also take them in a really big unit of 10 as well, which could be kind of fantastic for stratagem efficiency and buffs. On the other hand, Wardens are a bit more expensive, basically the same stat line, and I certainly would take the Guardian Spears as well. They skew to fairly nasty durability though, with a -1 to wound provided there's a character in the unit, and also a once per game feel no pain type save for a single phase that matters the most. I could certainly see both of them being played. They both have really good advantages, and are pretty hard to deal with for a lot of enemy units that fight on the battle line. In 9th place, we've got our first Primarch. Roboute Guilliman is 355 points. He's got a very intimidating stat line in 10th edition just on his raw combat and defense. Toughness 9, a 2+ save, 10 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable, and then resurrecting on death on a 3+ with that Armour of Fate, and not with a small amount of wounds remaining either. He comes back with 6 now. In combat, he should be able to deal with the vast majority of normal sized enemy units. 7 attacks at strength 14, AP 4 and damage 4, or sweep mode with the Emperor's Sword with damage 2 and devastating wounds. Definitely his damage and defense adds a whole ton of value, but on top of that he also gives the Space Marine army list basically a double Oath of Moment each turn. You can declare your main Oath of Moment on one target, and if you get to kill that target you get to move on to the second, and also get the 4 rerolls to hit and wound against that. One of the main downsides of Oath of Moment is that it's really quite focal and only helps you out so much at one time. This could double its value against a whole ton of enemy armies that have got tough stuff that you need to kill. If just raw damage dealing is a bit less relevant this round, you could just change that out for a free stratagem, say for some reactive Armour of Contempt defense maybe. I would say the Oath of Moment does have some pretty massive value. Overall looks very intimidating for the 355 points, big damage and a massive army-wide buff rule that can seriously change the game. Next up, and perhaps quite a niche unit that's really received a big boost in 10th edition, is the Thousand Suns Mutalith Vortex Beast. For the most part in the 40k rules so far, it's generally tended to be either okay to underwhelming, but now it just seems pretty undercosted for what it brings at 145 points for an all-round dangerous monster. Hard to go wrong with being pretty tough, really quite massive shooting, decent combat, and some bonus mortals. First up, he's very tough with 13 wounds, a toughness 10, a 4+ save and a 5+ invulnerable, and a 5+ feel no pain on top of that. The invulnerable save and the feel no pain I think are perhaps the biggest deals for that. It's just going to be a bit of a slog to get through with just about anything, whether it's dedicated anti-tank firepower or volume fire. Then his shooting is at least somewhat close range, out to 24 inches maximum, but it's both surprisingly powerful and surprisingly flexible. You can have a single pretty awesome anti-tank shot with strength 18, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 6, that hits on 3s and it's at least a pretty credible chance of killing most normal vehicles in one shot. Or otherwise, if there's no hard targets around, he can use a 2d6 Torrent Flamer with strength 6 and AP -1, that could be nice for Overwatch as well, or just some anti-heavy infantry with d6 plus 3, strength 9, AP 2 and damage 2 attacks. Then he also gives them a bunch of mortal wounds out to enemies nearby, roll a d6 for each unit within 6 inches at the end of his movement, and it's usually either 1 mortal wound or d3 mortal wounds to all enemy units nearby. That's pretty threatening, particularly if you have multiple of these on the go. And then after that, when you follow that up with a charge, he's also surprisingly dangerous there as well. 5 attacks at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 4, or 15 attacks at strength 7, AP 0 and damage 1 to deal with hordes. Overall for his points cost, he's just an all-around fairly crazy threat. Seems very hard to go wrong with Thousand Suns these days. I feel like taking a trio of these and just throwing them at your opponent is rarely going to be the worst idea. They've just got loads of defense and lots of helpful damage, and seem great for scrapping for midfield objectives. They even boost your Kabbalistic Ritual range as well for units nearby. Otherwise, also voted joint 8th with the Mutalith are the Necron Warriors, very much a unit that aren't going to be here just for their base stat line, but just for all the support they can get with a massive amount of buffs from the Necron Index. Necron Warriors are 120 for 10 or 240 for 20. I'd guess usually 20 is going to be the number to build around, unless you're taking units of 10 to run a Ghost Arc. Their range damage and their durability I think is both merely okay for the 12-point cost. They do get a bunch of lethal hits from the Gauss, so they should at least chip away at tougher stuff, and the durability is kind of fine but not standout at toughness 4 and a 4+ save. As they're famed for though, their real strength comes from all the reanimation shenanigans that they can do. Their base datasheet reanimation is kind of fine, D6 resurrected normally, or D3+3 if they happen to be standing on an objective marker, but perhaps the biggest deal for them is that they can do it out of sequence in the enemy turn if they need to, and also get lots of other buffs on top of that base number. If you have a Canoptek Reanimator lurking somewhere in the backfield and in range of them, then every time they reanimate you can get an additional D3 of them back, and they could be reanimating around about 4 times after the enemies attack them once. You can do so for a 1 command point reactively in the enemy turn, and Overlord could allow you to do that for free with his free stratagem. If you have run an auxiliary squad to allow a Ghost Arc into the list, again that could allow you another reactive reanimation to enemy shooting or combat. And if you do have a Resurrection Orb in the unit from that Overlord, say, then you also get to reanimate both in your turn and in the opponent's command phase as well. Even just with that alone, that would in theory be around about 10 warriors standing up from the dead, obviously provided your opponent hasn't wiped the unit. Basically, between some combination of these buffs, it's easy to basically replenish the entire squad, provided they haven't been thoroughly wiped out. The Reanimator, the D3+3, and multiple reanimations means that you could easily average over 20 if you wanted to. Then besides the reactive reanimations, the main game is to just make them as durable as possible, and having Cryptex in the unit makes that surprisingly easy. You can either get a -1 to hit at range and melee from the Chronomancer, a 5+ Feel No Pain from the Technomancer, or a 4+ Invulnerable save from Oricon the Diviner. All of those are absolutely fine, and are great durability buffs for the cost. You can give one of your characters the Hypermaterial Ablator. That one gives you stealth and light cover outside of 12 inches. And if you are taking Cryptex, it's probably worth throwing in a couple of Crypto Thralls into the unit. They're just 20 points for additional solid bodies with 4+ Feel No Pain and 2 wounds. Really quite nice to tank damage and then reanimates with that boosted reanimation protocols. Finally, if you're really going the whole hog for a Castle Necron battle line, you could even have Illuminor Serraz on the go, reducing enemy AP of attacks and making the own Necron Warriors or Immortals attacks better, so a little bit of extra danger as well as yet more defense. Basically, unless the opponent can fully wipe out the unit, and to do so would take a ridiculous amount of damage with the amount of defensive buffs they can have, then the Necron Warrior squad's probably going to survive, has a good chance of replenishing itself all the way back up to full health each turn, and will continue to chip away at you with a bunch of lethal hits or close combat attacks. Definitely a very intimidating unit to remove from points that some armies probably just aren't going to be able to kill. Next up, we've got our first disturbing anti-tank Eldar unit, this one being the D-Cannon Support Weapon Battery. These things do cost more points now, 85 points, and you only get 1 per unit, but even so it looks remarkably efficient for Ignor's line of sight firepower, 24-inch range, D3 attacks with blast, strength 16, AP 4, and a huge damage D6+2, all with heavy and devastating wounds. That stat line is just really nice area denial on a bunch of levels. Blast means that it'll be a bit more effective against elite infantry than it otherwise would be. Heavy and excessive AP means that the indirect fire penalties just don't really matter too much for it. And it's also one of the units that profits amazingly well from the reroll 1 hit and wound thing that they get in their detachment. Then you can either use Farseers or native Fate Dice 6s to feed 6s into the devastating wounds characteristic. So if you can get at least 1 hit on your target, you can lock in D6+2 mortal wounds if you have a 6 or a Farseer available nearby. It means that with a good roll you could be wiping out entire squads of light to elite infantry if you roll well on the damage, but even if they're entirely unbuffed they're still pretty efficient. Say for example one platform will average around about 6 or 7 wounds to a 3+ save vehicle, even if they're shooting out of line of sight. Finally, it also hands out a little debuff as well. If it hits a unit that isn't either a monster or a vehicle unit, they also have -1 to hit next turn, just in case the raw damage efficiency of this thing wasn't quite good enough. Overall, just seems like a pretty easy choice to have somewhere around 1 to 3 of these, hiding out of line of sight in your deployment zone, and really punish the enemy for trying to take objectives with tough units. In 6th place, we're back to the Thousand Suns with Magnus the Red. His 10th edition rules have seen some enormous increases. He's decently tougher than he was with the new Toughness 11 and a 2+ save, on top of the 4+ invulnerable and -1 damage he had before. He still remains very fast, and he has just absolutely enormous damage output, both with his psychic shooting and his massive combat. When he shoots, he'll be throwing out a bunch of Strength 9 and Damage 3 attacks, usually around 6 of those with devastating wounds, plus Tzeentch's Firestorm for around about 6 more with Strength 5 and Damage 2. All of those attacks with +1 to hit and +1 to wound with his own buff, so work out being very general purpose even against really heavy stuff. In combat it's kind of similar, Strength 16 and Damage 3 with a +1 to wound, or a sweep attack with a bunch of Damage 1 attacks. Both of those are awesome, and he does have good enough movement to make those felt on enemies that matter. It's going to be a lot harder for your opponent just to gun down off the table, now he can actually hide behind obscuring ruins. Still might be a little bit tricky to keep him safe with those massive wings, but at least now it shouldn't be super easy for everything on the battlefield to gain an easy line of sight to him. Otherwise, he can also hand out those +1 to hit and wound for psychic attacks to things like Scarab Occult Terminators using their ensorcelled rounds shooting. That gives them extra strength and makes their attacks psychic, and they can just mow down most things off the board, particularly if you have Twist of Fate to spare. He himself is also an absolutely great focal point for any rituals and stratagems that you have going. 1 command points to reroll hits and wounds with his psychic shooting attack is pretty devastating if you're not using that elsewhere. And while basically all the rituals are great on him, potentially the double move is particularly interesting for late game pushes. With a 16-inch move he could be moving 32 inches and then dealing out a huge amount of range damage. He could jump pretty much to the other side of the board and start smashing enemy backline units and taking down key things off objectives. Still costs a fair amount of points for the privilege, but looking like a very strong choice for the Thousand Suns army now. I'd expect to see him played in a fair few competitive lists. Next up we've got the Questoris Knights, which I kind of found it hard to pick any individual winners out of this. A lot of them more tend to vary by their special rules and gun choice, as opposed to being massively different as units. Depends what sort of combination of ranged weapons and melee weapons you want on them. Knights in 10th edition are looking just massively challenging to deal with for a whole bunch of armies. Kind of oppressive stats against some armies, loads of toughness 12 bodies that some enemies just aren't going to have enough anti-tank to deal with. And on some terrain boards they'll get almost unrestricted shooting as well due to their towering shooting, now just not being a disadvantage for them but also an advantage to fire over ruins or through windows. It's a pretty interesting combination that, as well as getting this boosted toughness stats and also much better guns for some reason, they also managed to go down in points. It does feel like they really bucked the trend of a lot of 10th edition changes, where a lot of shooting got a bit less dangerous, but things like the Avenger Gatling cannon basically went up to 18 shots rather than 12, getting huge boosts. Both the Questoris and the Abhorrents can buff Armigers and War Dogs as well, though in general just for raw unit efficiency I feel like the Imperial Knights really do have the edge over the Chaos at the moment. They get the big reroll ones built in their detachments, and they also have a helpful 6+ Feel No Pain type save as well, which is just really nice to add yet more durability to an already tough army, potentially even going up to a 5+ Feel No Pain if you can take down the enemy Warlord at some stage. Most of the Questoris Knight variants really are quite strong, maybe these might be a few of the more standout ones. The Knight Crusader is now just over 400 points, and he patched that very scary 18-shot Avenger profile, plus a second big gun, and +1 to hit for him and an Armiger. The Night Warden gets a massive -1 damage, and the Avenger Gatling cannon gets devastating wounds as well. Canis Rex just seems spectacular for his raw stats at 405 points, dangerous enough shooting, an absolutely massive melee, and even Sir Hector getting out can be kind of handy. And perhaps out of the Chaos Knights, the Knight Despoiler with things like double rapid fire battle cannons or double Avenger Gatling cannons again is kind of monstrous for how many points it costs. Space Marine armies aren't going to be pleased to eat 36 shots at Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 2. Most of the others tend to be at least fairly strong as well. As I said, I feel like the Imperial ones feel a bit more oppressive compared with the Chaos ones. Certainly Imperial Knights paired with Armigers is looking like a ridiculously scary list going into 10th. Next up we've got another Primarch. Lionel Johnson was voted 4th, 380 points for the Primarch of the Dark Angels. He's a lot more about raw melee might and survivability, not having the same sort of buffing rules as Roboute Guilliman does, but he's more than capable of taking the fight to the enemy with just ridiculous defensive stats and very big melee threat. For his toughness, he's got Lone Operative, as Guilliman does, provided he's near other infantry, toughness 9, a 2+ save, 10 wounds again, but he gets a 3+ invulnerable for the Emperor's Shield, and perhaps even more importantly, he's got a built-in -1 to wound against everything, which means that anything that's strength 8 or below may as well not bother really. And even the best anti-tank around like las cannons are only going to be wounding on a 4+, and then he's going to be shrugging off those saves on a 3 anyway. Mortal wounds should usually be the best way to kill him, but even then he does have the option of flexing into a 4+ save against those too. Then he's got fairly similar melee stats to Guilliman, 8 attacks at strength 12 damage 4 or 16 at strength 6 damage 2. And just in case you thought that you could take him down in close combat, he also has the fight first special rule as well, meaning that if you charge him then he's usually going to be hitting you before the enemy does, so anything that you send after him in combat needs to be able to tank a round of that fairly mighty damage before they even get to swing. Overall, a very dangerous model to have on the other side of the table. I feel like perhaps the challenge for the other player might be to try and kill the other models in the board, attempt to make Mr. L. Johnson go after some chaff infantry units or screening things, and play around him and try and keep him out of the game where possible. It's pretty much always going to cause problems though if you've just got a ridiculously durable and dangerous unit fighting for midfield objectives. Next up, we've got more scary Eldar. Another unit that's really benefited from all their detachment rules are the Fire Prisms. Very cheap and effective anti-tank here. 125 points for a seriously scary anti-tank gun on a good platform. Awesomely reliable with some rerolls, and also it's not hard to keep all of them basically hidden while they deal their massive damage. The Fire Prism chassis is okay, 14-inch movement, so fairly good there. Toughness 9, a 3+ save and 12 wounds. Seems pretty reasonable for the fairly cheap cost of 125. On top of it though, you get that massive prism cannon, 60-inch range, 2 attacks hitting on a 3, strength 18, AP 4 and damage 6. A very scary gun that, but perhaps even more scary because it basically always rerolls all hits and all wounds due to a combination of its own crystal targeting matrix and the Eldar detachment rerolls. You're quite often going to be getting 2 wounds on your target, and even taking for account of failure, you're still averaging something around about 9 or 10 wounds turn on things like a toughness 11 3+ save vehicle without an invul save. Obviously kind of swingy and in multiples of 6 though, and invulnerable saves will decrease it quite a bit. That's already kind of terrifying on that kind of stat line for 125 points each, but perhaps one of the most obnoxious things about them is their linked fire special rule. That means that fire prisms can all draw line of sight through another fire prism that they can see. So if you have 2 sort of loitering in the backfield with line of sight to a third one, they can all fire through that third one that's got the best line of sight out of the 3 of them. Potentially the first 2 can stay hidden behind ruins in your own deployment zone, the third one can maybe be a bit more adventurous but remain within line of sight, and then potentially even use fire and phase to hide behind terrain after it's shot. Means that you could have all of that anti-tank firepower of 3 prisms, and against some armies you might still not be able to shoot any of them at all. On top of that, it's also got a little bit of work that you can do against more infantry type things, a bonus shuriken cannon for a bit of small arms fire, and dispersed fire mode that you can use against hordes if there's no tough targets to take down, all hitting at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2. At least you can't go linked fire on those, I suppose. Overall, just hilariously dangerous and massively long-range flexible anti-tank firepower, perhaps a level above just about whatever any other faction can field at those kind of points. Next up, and voted just into second place, we've got the Primaris Desolation Squad, 120 points or 240 for some massive barrage fire, plus some direct fire damage as well that's nothing to sniff at. I have made an entire unit review of these, which I'll link down in the video description below if you'd like to see a unit breakdown in a bit more detail. Starting out, 24 points for an intercessor body isn't really too bad on the defensive side of things, not considering that they're a mainline damage dealer unit. Kind of surprising that you trade out a bolt rifle for this sort of level of guns for just 5 points. First up, their direct damage is kind of fine. Super crack missile launchers are at strength 10, AP 2 and damage D6 plus 1. I feel like if they literally just had that and nothing else, they might still be just about playable. Probably not very standout, but still that's a fairly fearsome anti-tank profile at long range, not bad for a 24-point model to start with. The really good thing about them though is their barrage fire. They all got D3 shots at strength 4 and AP 0 with the Castellan launcher, maybe not sounding like much, but with the blast keyword it means they get a serious amount of shots against any sort of horde infantry units, and they do ignore any indirect penalties as well when they're standing still, hitting on 3s, and the enemy doesn't get cover. On top of that, the Sergeant also gets a Vengor launcher with D6 shots, always hitting on a 2+ at strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2. Between those two profiles, a unit of these will fairly comfortably delete most horde-style units on their base stats alone. That's already very good for just removing fragile units hiding or key units on objectives, but they can also access all sorts of very easy buffs as well. Obviously one of the easiest being Oath of Moment, which is very nice on low strength firepower, and it's not bad on the Vengor launcher either. As well as that though, you can use a 1 command point in the Devastator Doctrine to get AP -1, makes the Castellans far more general purpose, and Storm of Fire can give you sustained hits as well, and worse in the Devastator doctrine, you'd usually give that to an Apothecary or a Librarian, both of which can do their own durability things for the unit as well. With some combination of these stat buffs, they're basically quite a big threat to just about any infantry in the game. They even have okay efficiency against heavy infantry like Terminators, at least for Ignore's line of sight firepower, which you wouldn't really expect out of anti-infantry shooting. Then, if and when it makes sense to, you can maybe step them up and have them both fire out of line of sight and also do a bunch of direct shooting with the super cracks. Might not even be necessary in certain games, but if that is going to make the difference at a key moment in the game and just absolutely devastate some direct fire targets, then all well and good. Basically, I think that'd be kind of strong if they only had their indirect firepower. That'd be kind of fine if they just had their direct firepower. But having a unit with both of them and just costing them 24 points per model means they're sort of auto-include for most Space Marine lists now, and certainly seem to be one of the most strong/overpowered things in the faction by a very long way. Finally, and currently voted as the single strongest unit in Warhammer 40k 10th edition by you guys at least, is the Eldari Wraithknight and its horrifically scary Wraith cannons. Just in case the fire prisms and the D cannons hadn't done quite enough general purpose damage to heavies so far, the Wraithknights just seem remarkably strong for what they do. 370 points, so cheaper than a lot of Imperial Knights, but against a lot of attacks actually similar to better durability. 12 wounds at a 2+ save, 18 wounds and -1 damage. I think overall that's generally going to be better defense against most firepower compared with a Questoris Knight. The 2+ save and the -1 damage built in is very nice indeed. If you've got one of these as well, you can also access a very easy -1 to wound from a Farseer that can go on him, and that is kind of monstrous on toughness 12 units. You're going to struggle to kill this thing when las cannons are wounding it on a 5+. Like the Imperial Knights, it also has towering shooting, so it means that if you're playing on a table with ruins with windows in them, you're really going to struggle to hide anything from its line of sight. And if you can't hide anything, then that's probably going to be a problem with those heavy Wraith cannons on the go. It can either take 2 of them or trade out one of them for a 4+ invulnerable save, but if not, each of them fire at D3 attacks, strength 20, AP 4 and damage 2d6, again works great with the single rerolls, and perhaps more importantly, those automatic 6 fate dice as well. Either use a Farseer for an automatic one, or just use one of your native ones, plug that into the wound roll, and get 2d6 mortal wounds on your target if you get at least 1 hit. That really is pretty massive at 36-inch range and not really caring about obscuring either. Also coming out of such a massively tough platform. A few turns of 2d6 mortal wounds going into the enemy's favourite units turn on turn is generally not something they're going to be able to ignore, never mind any of the actual damage that you get from other Wraith Cannon shots besides that. You probably are going to roll another 6 or 2 over the course of the game for yet more mortals, never mind the actual direct damage. The Wraithknight's also potentially very scary for Overwatch as well. If the enemy moves within 24 inches of it, then it's 1 CP for that, and then the Farseer's rule means that you can convert a dice to an auto 6 each turn, not each battle round, so you could get an automatic hit at least with a heavy Wraith Cannon. Not going to be getting the mortals most of the time, but usually that's going to be a wound with 2d6 damage and AP 4, which could spell doom for an enemy heavy. It does have access to most of the other decent enough Eldar movement shenanigans stratagems as well, which definitely have a lot of power in their own right. As well as all that, it's a casual objective control 10 as well, like the Imperial Knights. It means if it's standing on an objective, then it's going to be a big problem for enemy units. Unless you've got lots of objective control 2 troops, then you're probably not holding it against this thing. Overall, very, very scary stuff. Certainly one of the bogeymen of the meta right now, and not really too surprising to see why it's been voted quite this high for having quite such an impression on the board. So anyway, there we have it. There's a breakdown of 10 of the strongest units in Warhammer 40k right now. Let me know your thoughts on them down in the comments below. Have you had much luck with them, either playing with or against? And are there any other units that you think have been underrated here and not mentioned on the list? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description. Making all the content on the channel does take a fair amount of time and effort, and if you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.